going over your annotated bibliography, not just like the requirements and things, but the actual like how to do the annotations, what goes in it, how to write it, what to do, what not to do, look at some examples and things like that. And then you're going to do an activity to help you sort of practice the CRAP test on one of your sources and to write a draft of your first annotation. So we're going to start with kind of reviewing some of the information about the genre and its components. And when I say genre, I mean like kind of the type of text that it is. Of this genre is to gather and like present useful information, useful sources on a given issue. And this is a type of tertiary source. It's a list of resources that are supposed to give you information about kind of the whole scope of a conversation. It shouldn't be like a works cited page, like a list of like evidence or things like that. It's supposed to be more of a resource for somebody else, and it's not just something that people write for classes because they've been assigned to. It's a genre that like is super common in the academic community. I have lots of like books of annotated bibliographies on genre, on like teaching research, on all that kind of stuff, and they're categorized into different kind of subtopics, so you can look and find like resources and potential books and articles that are going to be useful, and that's what they're for. And the writer is sort of more like the collector, like they are the author of the annotated bibliography is more of the collector. They're not supposed to be providing their own commentary or things like that. They're just saying like, here's this list of sources, here's what they're about, and that's kind of the goal. Some common genre conventions are typically like, it's kind of a genre that's used across different sources. I mean, different fields, different majors. So it is one of those genres that's used widely. Is to like be objective and stay in present tense, to like summarize and explain the main points of the source so readers know what they're about. To provide those, you always see it almost like as it does kind of look like a works cited page, just the bibliographic citations, and then with each one is like a paragraph or two of commentary. Often there's a reflection. It does depend on like what if it's for a class, like you wouldn't find a reflection in, I guess, like from a scholar in an annotated bibliography, but you might be asked to do one for a class when the purpose is more to track your research. We're going to be doing reflections in this class. Otherwise, I won't be asking you to do them in your annotated bibliography. What you're going to have is your bibliographic citation in either MLA or APA. You'll have a summary, which includes like stating the main point of the article or source, the summary details, and like how that source contributes to the conversation, the credibility, which includes like the author expertise and or their like stake in the issue, the potential author bias if it's relevant, and the relevant like publisher info and bias. And a tip for this is like for news organizations and documentaries, like bias is almost always relevant. For news, political slant of the publication is always, kind of worth noting. So kind of to add on from there, some reminders just from your assignment sheet about what you're doing is for each source, you have a bibliographic citation in either MLA or APA and an approximately 125 word annotation. And when you're thinking about like having to have like the summary and how it contributes to the conversation and the author information, you're basically answering three key questions about the source. First, like, what is this source about? Sorry, it moved. What is the source about? So like that's the main point and the details that break down how the writer accomplishes that point. How does it fit in or contribute to the bigger conversation? So you can think of this question also as like, what makes this source useful? Like what makes it worth reading? And we'll go into some details about how to think about that question a little bit more later on, and like who is behind it and why when you're thinking about like the author information. So here's an example of kind of what it looks like with some of this kind of labeled. So this is a little bit older annotation that I'm using for my example here. So it's a little bit older source. It wasn't too old at the time that it was written. So you can see like written in this is MLA format. If you're doing like the author last name and the author like name here the exact same way, and then you have in parentheses you have the date like after it, then you're kind of working with APA format. So you have this, and then this paragraph kind of includes everything. This first sentence in this article, Nestor Lopez Duran discusses the 2009 longitudinal study examining correlations between victimization and psychotic symptoms. That's the main point. The first sentence, it labels like that it's an article, not like a book or a blog. Sometimes that really like kind of can be confusing if you don't know what kind of text it is, whether it was something you watched, or it was like an article with commentary, or it was supposed to be like a book chapter. If we don't know, if that's not labeled. And then you have the summary details here, which break down a little bit more like what this longitudinal study like examined and what it found. And then you have what it adds to the conversation. This is a recent study, and the presentation of possibilities and symptoms aids in understanding how effects could be interrelated and mutually causational. So it explains that this text is important because at the time this was a recent study, and it presents something important to understand about the issue. And then you have the author information here at the end. Lopez Duran is currently an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Michigan, where he researches mood disorders concerning children and adolescents. He also coordinates neuropsychology assessment services at the University Center for Child and Family and is an editor. So you have some, sorry, I don't know why I keep doing that. So you have like what his like profession is. This is kind of like a scholarly source. He is a scholar. It shows like what specifically he researches that makes him an expert. It's super specific. It explains what his other like affiliations are. So really good like relevant information about the author here. So we're going to start here with just like kind of part one of going over summaries. And just some common like conventions here. We're talking about like being able to write in different genres and figure out what the conventions are. And conventions are like, expectations. When the author is reading, when your reader is reading your annotated bibliography, what are some things they're going to expect? Some rules they're going to expect you to follow because it's an annotated bibliography. And your readers here are other potential scholars, other people interested in this issue. So kind of assumed to be other people within the academic community that are going to be looking for following academic standards. So here's some sort of like rules, like kind of with the writing, some like important expectations. Remember, this is a super formal genre because it's, especially because it kind of goes across different fields. So there are a lot of sort of like, I guess, agreed upon features. And the more rules, the more formal the genre is, I guess we've talked about this before when we went over genre, like the more rules there are to follow. So it's a pretty rigid genre. So you'll have a lot more rules with this assignment than you will with the digital essay. But to get started, okay. So the first thing is you need a really strong first sentence. The first sentence should really like pack a lot of punch, so to speak. It should introduce your source using specific information like title, author, like type of text. Make sure you name the type of text. Don't use the term source because that tells us nothing about the type of text that it is. And present the main point or the goal. That's all in the first sentence. So there's a lot that needs to kind of be included in that. So again, like referencing the specific genre of the source is super important. So just name it as like a blog, a news article, a documentary, a book chapter, a scholarly article in an academic journal. Oh, sorry. I don't know why it keeps bouncing around like that. Stay focused. The main purpose, thesis, main points, and I say stay focused, kind of I'm talking about just making it concise and not fluffy. And I want to explain that because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what it means to not be fluffy or not, or to be concise. Sometimes I'll have people say, if they just like write 2 sentences and they don't have examples and they don't have like evidence and they were trying to be concise, but that is not conciseness. Conciseness is not about saying less or cutting out necessary details or being less developed. If you're leaving out those things, it's not concise. It's just underdeveloped. Conciseness is about careful language choice and staying focused. It's like fluffy would be lots of extraneous examples that are unnecessary or aren't the best ones. Conciseness might still be having examples or evidence, but choosing the best, staying very on track with like explaining those examples and being careful with your language, saying as much as you can in as few words as possible. So it's about careful selection of content and language, not about leaving things out. So just to be clear about that. And it does take a lot of practice, and sometimes it's not even like the thing that you're good at. Like, I'm not super good at being concise. I have to write it, and then I have to go back and revise it for conciseness. I have to do every year I have to do what's called like an annual review, where I have to do these little reflections about like how my year went, my class, and all that stuff. And I have to always like write the thing. We have a max, not a minimum. Writing teachers and wordiness. So we have a max. We can't go over like a certain number of words, and I'll have to write the thing, and then I'll have to go back and cut like 500 words out to make it underneath the max amount that I can write. So as you can see, it's not my thing, but I know how to go back and work on it after I'm done with my drafting. Stay in present tense. So like saying like the author says, not said, or states, not stated. This can be tricky. It's okay to use past tense when you're referencing information like the source talks about. Like if you say like, you know, the author talks about a book that was written in 1999, that makes sense. If you say, try to make that stuff present tense, it gets weird. Like the article discusses a book that is written in 1999, doesn't make sense, right? Like, but when you're referencing the article itself, you stay in present tense. So I guess an example could be like the article references. So I'm talking about the article, the source itself that I'm writing about. So that's present tense. The 1994 news article reporting on the shooting that occurred. So I could say occurred because the events talked about in the article are past tense. I'm talking about the article. I say the article references, the author states, the book reviews, and keep those things in present tense. I know it sounds tricky and super tedious, but it is something to practice because we do consider academically the present tense to be the more formal and appropriate tense to write in. Okay, so here is another kind of example annotation here, just to point out what I mean by like this strong first sentence. Like in this article, again, like type. You have Nestor Duran Lopez discusses a 2009 longitudinal study. They've got like the name of the author, the kind of text, the year the study was conducted, and then like the main point. Like it's all there in the first sentence. And then the several summary details that break it down. Nestor Lopez Duran states, so that good solid present tense, that findings point to bullying as having different levels of consequences for victims. He notes, again, like present tense, the study results indicate that adults who have experienced, see past tense here, because it's content from the article, experience psychotic disorder likely have a history of victimization, and that being bullied, again, sorry, it's jumping. Being bullied during childhood doubles the risk of developing psychotic symptoms. So you kind of get the idea here. An example of some common errors in summaries. I'm going to look at like, use this example, and I'll come back to these examples over and over again as we're kind of breaking it down. But what I'm going to show you here is, this is the revised summary. I'm going to go over in a second. This is the original. This source breaks down several aspects of depression, starting with age groups. The authors do a remarkable job of comparing all differences in all ages between children and adolescents. They go in depth about all different causes and types of depression. Also, they discuss possible outcomes of depression along with treatments. It's not that this is an incorrect source, it's that it's pretty vague. It's hard to get really a strong sense of what it is that they're doing. First, they use the word source instead of stating that this is a book, which really helps, because I don't know if this is like a website from an organization. I don't know if this is like from a government document, if this was a study. Like I don't know. There's not enough really like details there about what's going on. I just want you to see the revised summary that's a little bit more developed and also concise. You'll see it's not much longer, but it packs a lot more punch. This book breaks down and compares aspects of depression among various stages of child development from infancy to adolescence. The authors detail types of depression such as bipolar depression and seasonal mood disorders, as well as their causes. Finally, they explain possible outcomes, assessments, and treatments of diverse types of depression across varying age ranges. Again, there's not huge differences there, just a little bit more specificity with the language to make it clearer what's going on here, especially with adding in like details about the kinds of depression that they're going over, kind of more specificity about like the age ranges and things that they're explaining. It's just more helpful in their revised version. Okay, we're going to go over the last couple of points for the strong summaries. Paraphrases. We're going to practice paraphrasing very soon. And paraphrasing to show understanding and not to rely on quotes. One of the things about a lot of direct quotes is that it combines a lot of different styles, and it makes it very choppy and very difficult to follow, especially if the quotes aren't like super carefully selected so that there's absolutely no details in them that we don't need. And paraphrasing just sort of helps to translate and make things clearer. I'm going to go over an example that shows like I'm going to give you an example of this where it's like terms and phrases that are used, and they're very specific, like disciplinary specific terms and things used in the articles could be okay. But you really want to stay away from relying on direct quotes to write the summary, because then you aren't summarizing it. The author is summarizing it, summarizing their own article. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but the big thing we're going to be practicing here is objectivity, the perspective, the style. This is the example of when we're going over the assignment sheet. One of the things that I said was if you're writing this and you're thinking, man, I wouldn't want to read this, this is so boring, then you are doing it right. Because when we say objectivity, the gist of that is like having a lack of passion, not having any sense of writerly presence. Like you are reading all of this with absolutely no sense of the author, their stake, opinion, and it's some of these things that we're going to work on are really helpful for practicing maintaining that tone, and a lot of fields really value this, and it's I think it's an important skill as a writer to be able to be flexible and to write in different styles, and being able to write objectively is very important. Readers should not be able to discern your opinion on the issue or how this source is going to help you personally. You're writing for someone else's benefit, not your own. I mean, theoretically, because we're also writing this for class, so it is kind of for you too. But the first thing is to use signal phrases, otherwise known as author signals. So sometimes I'll use those terms interchangeably because they kind of mean the same thing. Things like saying according to the author, many supporters maintain, and it's a trick of language that allows you as the writer to take a step back, to not be present in the writing, and to make sure that opinions are attributed to whose opinions they are. If they're opinions that the author is talking about, then it's important to say according to the author, so we know that that is what the author is saying and not what you are saying. It's a way of writing removed, of writing objectively, of putting a barrier between yourself and what the author is talking about. You're reporting from a removed perspective. So it's important to make sure that it's very clear, because if you say, according to the text, global warming is real. I know that's something that was said in the article, but if you say, global warming is real, I don't know if that's your opinion as the writer, if that's something you pulled from the text, it makes it super unclear. Avoid evaluative adjectives to describe points. Sometimes it just is a kind of a giveaway. It's very gestural. The same thing with asking questions. We use questions to lead people, to engage people. Again, we're writing without passion. So you're assuming that the readers here are accessing your annotated bibliography because they're already interested in the issue and you want to know more. It's not on you as the writer to engage them. That's not the style that we're writing in. So you don't need to ask questions. You want to avoid like saying they did a great job or this was super interesting or things like that. Because the more you include more extra details and the fluff with the questions, that you add in, the more likely your opinion is to seep in. Avoid personal pronouns. Even when you're talking about how the source like adds to the conversation, you're talking about the source. You're not saying this is going to help me. It's not about what you're going to do with this source, what you learned, your paper, any of this stuff. It's about what this source adds to the conversation, so that the person looking at your annotated bibliography can decide if they want to read this source or not, if it's going to be useful to them. Okay, so signal phrases, avoid evaluative adjectives, asking questions, personal pronouns. We're going to look at some examples of this stuff. So here's an example here that I'm going to talk a little bit about. And I want to show with this one, again, I'm going to come back to this example a couple of times to talk about some different things, but I just want to show you here what I mean by not to rely on direct quotes. In this article, it states interesting facts and statistics on amputations and eye injuries. Currently, this is also an incorrect way to integrate the quote, but currently 49,460 blind veterans enrolled in the VA healthcare system, and that number is expected to increase because of the number of eye injuries in Iraq and Afghanistan. This first part said everything that we need to know to summarize it, to get the gist, which is what the summary does. It's supposed to boil things down. Quotes are details that we don't need right now. We don't need evidence. We don't need like these numbers and things like that. This is the gist of what's being talked about. So they could have just kept it down to this in this article. It states interesting facts and statistics on amputations and eye injuries that show an increase, and that's it. They didn't need this quote to get it across. If you wanted to talk about this, you could put it in your own words and make it a little bit simpler. But you want to avoid including these sorts of big chunks of direct quote into your summary. Here's one thing you could do. I'm going to pull this from the summary details in this one that we already went through. Finally, he examines possibilities why these children are at higher risk of developing psychotic disorders and discusses the dose response. A dose response is a disciplinary issue-specific term, so it's okay to quote that. Because you're not really relying on it. You're pulling something that's necessary. So the dose response, which deals with the effects based on how often a child is bullied. And notice, like, if you pause this video and like read through this, there's no sense of what this writer really thinks about the issue. Everything is removed. Everything is objective. Okay. Here's another example of a common error with this objectivity thing. I'm going to keep kind of going through this a little bit. In this last part, so if you read through this source does a couple of its annotation does a couple of really good things, like it names, like this is a peer-reviewed article. It stays relatively like in present tense. They get down here and it says, I believe this will be helpful because the article has an enormous amount of information that I can use for my research paper. This person has just turned this annotated bibliography into something personal for themselves and not something that they are writing for someone else. If the person accessing your annotated bibliography is not, if we're again doing this like simulated writing experience or situation, this person is not going to care how you plan to use it personally in your paper later. It's just to let them know what's useful about this source. Some of the information I could use would be possible regulations, trends and developments, dominant business models, and relevant stakeholders. I think it's okay to use it again, like we're not using I, we're not using me, we're not using the personal stuff. We're not recording things about how we plan to use our research in our papers in the next unit. Please keep notes if you have run across this kind of information and you want to keep it for yourself. You're welcome to, record that and copy and paste quotes and keep those kinds of things in your notebook for yourself. But just kind of keep in mind, like, this is a tertiary source with resources gathered for someone else. Again, the person reading this has no interest. The person you're gathering resources for is interested in how they're going to use it. They're not interested in what you're going to do with this source, only what they're going to do with it. So explaining who the author is and how it fits into the conversation is kind of what we're sticking with here. Keep your own notes if you want to use that. Finally, for this, I'm going to give you I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I'm looking for with the signal phrases. Again, like, it creates that third person objective perspective, and that line, it creates that objectivity and that writerly distance, and it also makes distinctions, again, like clear between like the writer and the source. It removes you. It's a way of removing you from it, talking about the text and attributing what's being said to the text and pulling yourself out. This is a skill that takes practice, and it's an expectation. It's a convention that's sort of expected across like a lot of academic, especially academic essayistic genres. And I'm going to show you an example of this with one of these examples I've been going through. In this article, here is an author signal or a signal phrase. Nestor Lopez Duran discusses a 2009 longitudinal study. I didn't begin it by saying a 2009 longitudinal study examines correlations between victimization and psychotic symptoms. If I had written it that way, I would be writing it from my perspective. But I don't want to do that. I want to pull myself out and write it removed. Write it from the perspective of, I guess, the article, the source itself. In this article, Nestor Lopez Duran discusses. Lopez Duran states that findings point to bullying. Author signal. Author signal, he notes that study results indicate. Next sentence. Finally, he examines. A good trick or tip to practice this is, at least where your summary is concerned, start, especially if you never practiced this before, start each sentence with an author signal and switch it up. Notice it's different each time. Nestor Lopez Duran discusses. Lopez Duran states. He notes. He examines. The study finds. He goes on to explore this. Next, he does this. But start each sentence with something that attributes it to the text itself or to the author. All right, summaries part 2. This is really specific. This is about how it contributes to the conversation and how to try to answer that question. So questions to ask yourself about how a source fits in the conversation or what it contributes. Here are some examples of questions you would ask yourself. Okay, so am I including this because is the research specifically strong and credible because it's from a scholar? If that's true, it's like your peer-reviewed article. You're just going to give details about the author's specific credibility, like this example does that we went over. This is because it's from an assistant professor of psychology. It's a study, it's credible, that's why it's being used. That's its usefulness. Does it represent what I would call a loud voice or perspective on the issue, even if there's some bias? Documentaries do this. Popular documentaries that everybody's watching, that are like trending on Netflix. Everybody's read them. They're going to expect it to be included as an important source in the conversation, an important text in the conversation, even if it has some bias. But you are welcome in this anti-bibliography. You are writing, you're not gathering evidence. You're gathering sources that illustrate what people are saying. Some of that's going to be biased. You're not trying to use them for evidence at this point. You're just gathering. So it's okay to include that documentary. Note that there's some bias, but that is it's popular. Is it foundational? So if you were looking at vaccinations and whether or not they cause autism, you would have to go back to that 98 study that's been since debunked that initially started the controversy, because everybody talks about it. Everybody goes back and references that study when they're talking about this issue. Or the Jenny McCarthy interviews, the celebrity interviews that were supposed to be like firsthand accounts of vaccinations causing autism. You would have to go back to those and include them, even though they're older, because they are foundational. If it's a study or an interview or something that started a controversy, it's like an initial source, or like it's a study that's often referenced by other people, it's foundational. It's important because everybody goes back to it. It lays the groundwork for the conversation. Is it older but is necessary to provide background on the issue? A lot of times your book sources are going to be older because the publishing process just takes some time. And so it's not going to be from 2020. It's going to be from like 2018, 2017, even if it's current. And if it is from 2020, it's talking about things that happened in 2017 because it takes that amount of time to get stuff out. But you might be using a book because it is older, but it gives more of a really important, credible, like in-depth overview or discussion or some background or context, and that's what it's for. Does it offer primary testimony or firsthand accounts, like interviews and things like that? Does it explore a new theory or a new solution that readers might not be aware of? Does it explore a particular perspective? Sorry. Does it explore a particular perspective or set of concerns? So like maybe you're including it in your current conversation because there's a couple of different perspectives, and this article really demonstrates or illustrates like what the concerns of this group are. It really demonstrates what their perspective is. That could be why you include it. And then again, there's lots of these. You wouldn't do this for every single source. You might write one or two sentences, but you have to decide like which of these is why you're including it. And avoid, when you're doing this, adding your own opinion about the issue, discussing how you might plan to use it in your paper, like avoiding those like, kind of common errors that people run into. So an example of common error, we did this with the summary. I'm going to come down here to the end. There's two authors to this book, and they have all these wonderful details about the authors. Sorry. But then when they get here, they said, this source is very useful for research and understanding the topic better. In what way? Exactly. Like, I know it is, like you're saying it's useful, but like, what's useful about it? That's like saying this source is very credible. Cool. How do you know that? Just making sure you give those details. This happens more often than people realize. Like they know it's useful, but haven't done the work to figure out like what's useful about it and write out the actual information that shows why it's useful. You shouldn't have to say it's credible. You shouldn't have to say it's useful. You're just stating like what you see that's there, and the reader can figure that out for themselves. And then I want to look at this. So here's an example of where like it adds, the example we've been looking at. So this is where it kind of fits in and explains again, like how it's useful. Like this is a recent study in the presentation of possibilities and symptoms aids in understanding how effects could be interrelated and mutually causational. They did one sentence. They figured out like why it's important is because it's a recent study from a scholar that helps you understand this about this issue. Is super specific, but it's one sentence that packs a lot of punch in terms of understanding why it's here, why it's included in this annotated bibliography. Okay, so the next part is looking at the credibility. So we did the summaries. We're going to look at what to do with this author background stuff, which is kind of going back to that question, who is behind the text and why? So some things to ask yourself or consider. And this is also part of like the CRAP test when we're going through like the authority of the text. What is the author's expertise? Like kind of thing. You don't necessarily have to name whether they have scholarly expertise or professional or personal, but it's important kind of groundwork thing to consider for yourself when you're deciding what to say, what's relevant. Do they have personal expertise, professional, or scholarly? That can help you figure out like what you want to say about it. What proof exists for this expertise, especially for the scholarly stuff, and for the professional. If it's a journalist, they might have professional expertise, but you need to be able to find like relevant affiliations, publications, especially making sure their publications and their like what they write about is specific. Maybe they have awards, things like that. Remember, you want to watch out for those really vague, unverifiable author background things, or people you can't find any information about. Their education or profession. Does the author have a stake or bias that is notable in the text? Maybe a particular like, especially if it's a super opinionated, like usually you can tell bias because you can hear a lot from the writer, often not as much from sources, but you can hear a lot of very emotional language and very strong language. We're talking about the issue, and that's a linguistic telltale sign of bias. Is being overly emotional and revealing what your stake is. You might be able to tell like if the author like really has like a political bias or a certain slant that's worth noting that's impacting the text, or you can tell that there's way more opinion than there is sources. Strong language, emotion, you can talk about that. Does the publisher have a particular stake in the issue? Again, political slant for news is always important. And noting like maybe what their reputation is, if they're respected, things like that. Bias also tends to exist with things like personal expertise and experience from organizations, blogs that are not academic, documentaries, and it could be worth noting for those as well. So again, like here's that example that I already kind of talked about. This one is, again, like what she notes is this is from a scholar. So we have their profession, like assistant professor, so their rank, almost assistant professor of psychology at this university. You could verify that. What their expertise is in, which is important. Again, like you might see some of those vague, like author bios that just say like this person is a freelance writer with a degree in English, but they're writing about technology. Not relevant. He also coordinates neuropsychology assessment services. So we know like another thing, like another affiliation and work related thing that he does that is part of his expertise and fuels that. So we have a lot of that for this person. Something, I guess, to watch out for is first this. This is a website article from the American Legion site that talks about how people need to do more with the intention of healing our physically injured veterans. So there's no author here, like exact author. This is just from a hired writer from the American Legion. That happens sometimes, but you still have a publisher to talk about. And here they did it with the American Legion. The American Legion is a nonpartisan organization devoted to the support of veterans. That's important to note. In this article, it states interesting facts and statistics on amputations. We did kind of this already. The website also gives people reasons why they should help our military. There's a little bit of the author coming out. It sounds like it's from the author. It could be why the website also gives people reasons why the American Legion thinks we should help our military veterans and ways they can help. This website is a very credible source. You shouldn't have to say that. Because it is a well-known organization that has been up and helping our veterans and servicemen since 1919. This is helpful information. It's good to have information, include information about the like organization or news source and things like that, especially if there's no direct author. You want to avoid this. Sorry, let me get back to it. No author takes credit for their work. You don't have to say that. If you can't find the author, tell readers about the organization, company, or publication. You don't have to state that there's no author. You just tell us the information that you do have. Again, the other thing I want to notice is they do have a really nice edition of the organization, stake, or purpose. They don't state like any bias or anything like that. Like the reader can, make their mind up about that, but the fact that the American Legion is a nonpartisan organization devoted to the support of veterans shows like this is what their stake is. This is why they care about the issue. And a lot of times like you can pull those from like mission statements and things like that. And it's important to have that information about organizations, especially that are behind the text that you decide to include. And that is the end. So summary, like the main point, the summary details, and what it adds to the conversation, and then the credibility, the who is behind it and why, information about the author, publisher, stake, that kind of stuff. And now you're going to go practice.